So topic today, Sugarbush rental rates. We're going to talk about rates. We're also going to talk about a lot of the factors and intangibles that go into either setting rates or navigating your relationship with between landowners and producers. A few resource things we'd like to share before we get going. We've got a couple great websites with a growing body of maple information from biology and tree health through to the business and syrup quality aspects of maple production. www.mapleresearch.org has a huge archive that's growing. Mark, I'll let you speak up if you want to on these other two.
Yeah, the nice thing about Maple Research is it's searchable. So if you have a topic area that you are particularly interested in, you can plug that into the search box on mapleresearch.org, and you'll get a bunch of different publications. There are a lot of issues. All the issues of Maple Digest are there, and so forth. The Proctor Maple Research Center also has a YouTube channel that is becoming quite robust with lots of videos, not just on the business side. Clearly, it's a lot about the research that we do and the practice of making syrup. And then just to confuse things, there's also a UVM Extension Maple website, and that has a variety of options, a lot of information, as well as the recordings from past Vermont Maple conferences. And I bring that up just because along the topics of things we're talking about tonight, we have a full-length presentation all about Sugarbush valuation, which goes into rental rates, but it also talks more broadly about why one particular Sugarbush would be worth more than the other and how you go about valuing it. And that presentation was done in 2017 by Rob Gay, who was a ag real estate appraiser. And there's some really good content there. So please feel free to check that out.
Great. And we're not done yet with websites. This webinar is actually part of a broader project where we've created another website, www.maplemanager.org. And this again is a growing resource with a combination of business and forestry tools and resources. Definitely relevant to tonight. We've got a Sugarbush lease template that we published several months ago that's available on that site. There's a number of business calculators, and a little later I'll reference the rental rate calculator that's just in the prototype phase, but we do have an active link we can share with everyone for that. So maplemanager.org is available. And then a plug for our Northeast Maple Benchmark project. This is a program that's been going on for over 5 years now. We are actively still looking for a small number of participants that would like to work with advisors on cost of production analysis and financial analysis. We are looking for some, well, this one's a little outdated. We had been looking for larger tap operations, and we continue to do that. But we are also working with anyone over $100,000 in gross sales per year, recognizing that we have some great business managers at 6,000 or 7,000 taps that have a quite sizable business that would love to do the analysis. So you can definitely go to this website or look me up on my email if you're interested with that. And then I think that brings us into the rental rates and the baseline survey that we're going to be referring to for a good bit of this presentation. In fall of last year, we had a Northeast producer survey. We ended up getting 312 responses from, I think, 6 or 7 states. And we covered a whole variety of topics from business management, production, yields, market channels, forestry, tree health, and tapping procedures. Tonight, we're going to emphasize the rental factors that were in that survey. Give you a sense of the span. I mentioned all the different states that were participating. Looking at the average tap numbers, we did have an average of 3,988 taps. If we wanted to get a little bit more balanced, looking at the spread of the sample, the median tap number was 1,000. And you can imagine there's a large breadth of producer scales that's reflected in the survey that we'll share with you. Definitely a lot of smaller operations under 1,000 taps, and then a smaller number of respondents that had 5,000 taps or more. I think from the whole 312, we maybe be looking at 25 to 40 respondents that were over the 5,000 tap margin. So those small number of very large tapper operations can pull that average up higher.
And that's reflective of the industry itself. You know, if you look at the most recent USDA Census of Agriculture, you see that only 7% of all maple producers in the US have 5,000 taps or more. So, you know, 93% of producers are less than 5,000 taps. But if you actually look at the total production from those operations, this is US wide, like just over 70% of all the syrup is made from that, just 7% of producers. So the sample was fairly well representatory of the industry as a whole.
Okay, so looking at that survey, we've got some information on how people are accessing woods. There was 1.2 million total taps in that survey that we did last year. The number of producers that rent taps, of the 312 that responded to the survey, 42% of those respondents indicated that they rent taps from another landowner. And then looking at the numbers a little bit differently, if we look at the tap count itself, the number of taps of the 1.2 million, we see that roughly 39% of those taps are rented or leased compared to 61% that are owned. I'd say just a good indication, renting and leasing access to woods, it's alive and well, not quite half, but definitely not an insignificant portion of the taps that are active in the United States right now. So who rents those taps? Again, we see rent all across the scales, but I think it's important to hone in on some of those larger operations as a means of expansion. We looked at that group of 5,000 tap or more operations that responded to the survey. 70%, 7 out of 10 of those producers were accessing more taps via rent or lease. So they owned a portion of taps and then very active in the rental community to access more taps. And we know from the cost of production and financial work we've done over the past few years that there is some trends with economic viability in relation to scale. And we know that as far as this survey, specifically the respondents in this survey, when we looked at the operations of 5,000 taps or more, they're 2 times more likely to be economically viable. So over twice as many by percentage of those larger operations indicate they're economically viable compared to other options in the survey, which were sustainable with the access to other employment or other income, or in some cases, people indicated their enterprise was vulnerable, that they weren't able to cover costs and they actually didn't have other sources of income to bridge the gap. Why do we care about rental rates? I think obviously, if you're a landowner, you're interested in cash payments, and if you're an operator, you want to be sure that you're paying the right rate on an annual basis, however the payments are structured. So we've got cash payment factors. Comparison to timber or other uses is certainly a consideration for landowners. They're making the decision of how to operationalize that resource base. There is some research out, we won't talk about it tonight, but there is some research several years old that does actually compare the economic return of tapping maple or accessing a rental rate for taps compared to timber sale. Valuation of in-kind trades and discounting and or succession plan, I'm going to lump those all together. There's a lot of reasons and ways that people share products or services rather than having a cash payment. And it's quite nice to actually know what the market rate is and to agree on the market rate for your tap rental, even if you're doing a valuation of in-kind, like a syrup barter, other services like excavation is common. I also want to mention succession planning. I work with a handful of business owners that are working on transitions, whether in family or out of family. And they're often considering discounting factors, and they're doing broader estate planning where the cash transaction may not reflect what they're tracking on a paper basis as people are considering, again, estate planning, future inheritance, or future buyout possibilities. So knowing the actual rate and having that communication is super important. We mentioned relationships. I think we'll mention them throughout this presentation, but there's all sorts of different ways that people are going to relate, not necessarily cash-based, and they're all gonna shape the relationship of the rent and the payment that you may make. Mark, do you have anything?
No, I echo that same point that if you don't know where the market is for a rental rate on a per tap basis, you don't really know where you stand in terms of these non-economic factors. You know, are you giving a really sweet deal, or are you not really giving such a sweet deal to someone that you're trying to support or help? So it's great to know your baseline, and you can make any adjustment, economic or otherwise, from there. But without knowing the kind of the where people are at with lease rates, it's hard to know. So when you think about a producer entering into an agreement and looking for a particular parcel, say they have capacity in their sugar house, perhaps they've just recently upgraded their evaporator, or for whatever reason they have capacity, they need to get more sap. Not every sugar bush is going to be equal, and there are a lot of similarities between sugar bush and sugar bushes that you might want to rent and real estate. So if you think about location being one of the most critical aspects of real estate valuation, it's very true for sugar bushes as well. So if you have a sugar bush which is near to your operation, ideally it would be even adjacent to an existing operation, but doesn't have to be. All those things, that location matters quite a bit. Another issue is access to road or power. So a particular parcel that you want to lease is going to be more or less attractive based on its ability to run a decent vacuum system, or be able to get into the woods and get the sap out. Total taps per acre, and average tree size, that's really the forest. What's growing there? What's the potential for that particular parcel to produce sap? And that's going to have a big part to play. You know, it's more attractive in general to find a well-stocked, generally higher average diameter sugar bush than it is to piece it together with lots of smaller sugar bushes. And so these things are generally going to push the per tap rental rate higher. It's going to make that more attractive than maybe sugar bushes that don't have those parts to it. This image right here, you can see that there's a lot of infrastructure needed to get the sap out of that parcel, but it made sense for that operation. So other investments you're going to have to make are going to also impact your willingness, or whatever you think is going to be a fair rate to tap those woods. You go down the next couple of slides, Mark. So tree size, obviously. Is there a forest management plan? Is there an inventory? Do you know really what trees are available? And can you reliably get an estimate of how many taps and the size of those trees? That's going to put you in a better position in terms of deciding how much, maybe above a base price for rental, that you'd be willing to pay. And then the last one, Mark, is really more, it's access to road, but it's also the infrastructure within the parcel. So are your woods roads decent? Can you get in and out and do the maintenance you need to maintain high yield? Are there adequate water diversion structures there? Or are you going to have to put all that in? Those costs, assuming that your lease agreement allows for it, those are going to reduce the viability of any given parcel you're going to rent. So make sure you're aware of what's there already. Are there any real issues with water or drainage that you need to be aware of before you enter into a rental agreement? Another big one, and this is going to be a little bit more on lease, developing a whole sugar bush lease, but it does factor into your per tap rate. If you're going into a brand new woods, never been tapped before, there's going to be significant investment in tubing infrastructure. It could, $15, $20 a tap. It could be less if you're totally dialed in and have the equipment. It could be more if you're paying an installer. but you need to factor that in. And what's your estimated yield going to be, and what do you think you can really pay off that investment in tubing? So you're going to want to think about lease length as being a critical factor in what you're willing to pay on a per tap lease. And that graph on the right is more results from the survey, and it generally shows what we expect, that the interval of replacing spouts is between 1 and 2 years. Drop lines are being replaced a little bit less than 5 years. The interval for lateral lines is right around 10, and then main lines somewhere around 15 years, but there's a lot more variability there. There's a little bit more to do with how robust it is and what people tend to use for materials. Ownership stability is also going to be a factor. So if you have a concern about whether or not this property is going to turn over, you can't necessarily look in a crystal ball and know, but if there's some indication that it's not a stable ownership, then that might, again, question how much you really want to invest in a particular parcel. And if there are any forest management restrictions. Again, this is a little bit more on lease, a full lease agreement, but if some of these things come up, it's going to impact what you would likely offer to pay as a producer on a per tap basis.
So now I think we'll get into some rates from some old data and from the survey.
Yeah, so this is some data that we got from a variety of sources, including ag lenders, some of the county foresters in Vermont, and some private consulting foresters who deal with lease rates. It's a little old, it's from 2017, and but clearly people are spending $1 a tap for the most part. There are some instances where it's less than that, but it is $1 a tap is pretty much the going average, and we can get into why when you start to see $1.50 and more, what are some of those factors. But as I said before, it's one of the biggest drivers is competition from other producers. So if you're in an area where there are more producers that also have capacity and are looking to buy into a stand and lease those taps, it's going to naturally drive up the price. Just like nice property on the lake is desirable, there's more people willing to pay for it, so the prices are going to go up. So maybe we should have led with this, but if you're asking, people want to know what the average tap rate is, dollar per tap for Sugarbushes in Vermont, it's a little bit like asking what's the average house value in Vermont or some other state. It gets you sort of in the neighborhood, but it definitely does not get you to a precise number. You just have to understand where you fall and how competitive that area is.
Okay, so those were 2017, and then looking back at the survey from last fall, we've got two different ways of looking at the data here. So I'm going to explain the pie chart on the left. This is includes all the people in the survey that said that we are in fact renting property. And the key difference between the pie chart on the left and the one on the right is the pie chart on the left includes the 16% of the respondents that did rent woods, but then indicated there was no charge, $0 per tap. We think that some of those people through their comments have actually had some barter or some exchange, but not all of them necessarily. So that is just an important feature of the pie chart on the left. There's a group of people here that had no charge or a $0 value is how they answered. And then not quite like Mark's, but similar, you can see the 37% of the respondents that rented were in the 50 to 99 cent group. And then the next largest pie, 43% were in the $1 to $1.24. We had a couple occurrences in this survey. Actually, we had 0 responses that were $1.25 to $1.49, and then a very small number of people that were $1.50 to $2. And then I think maybe 1 or 2 cases overall over $2. So, in a second, we'll show you some breakdowns by state, but we've got that. We know that sweet spot somewhere between 50 cents and $1.24 for the majority of people in different locations.
And if we take the people out who, it indicated that they did rent taps, but they didn't pay for it. You take those out, you see it's about 50% are in the dollar or more category, and the others are less than that. The other important thing to note about these two graphs compared to the last one, these two are really from that broader geographic area. And the graph before was focused primarily in Vermont, but we also had some New York and maybe a couple of New Hampshire people. And it's hard to underestimate the importance of geography when you're looking at some of these reported numbers, which is probably a good segue into the next slide.
Yeah, so here's a sample of just 2 states, but to give the comparative for the different features that different questions that we asked in the survey and that sugar makers responded to. If you really just focus in on the highlighted cells there in green, those are the highest percentages. So if you were to look down the Vermont column top to bottom, that should be close to 100% of the respondents from Vermont. And if you look down the Pennsylvania column on the far right, that should equal 100% of the respondents from Pennsylvania. We look at those green cells and we can see where the largest percentage of people fell that were renting. And for Vermont, we were in the $1 to $1.24 range. And then in Pennsylvania, we've got nearly 28% in that 50 to 99 cent range. Again, this is very coarse. We haven't broke it down here by zip code, and we don't have nearly the hundreds of responses to really feel confident in any predictive feature there. But we see this across the board, some of the similar trends there in New Hampshire and Maine as well, different states being in different places.
The other thing, within a state, you can have a diversity of rates. And in Vermont, for example, the county that produces by far the most syrup is Franklin County, and it's a highly competitive area for leases. And so you see the number going up and up. So now it's not unheard of to have $1.50 or $2 a tap in Franklin County, whereas you really wouldn't see that in maybe some of the counties that don't have quite as much competition from other operations. So, parts of the southern Vermont, and really not even that far away from Franklin County, you can see lease rates that are quite a bit lower. We are starting to see, as those tappable woods become developed in Franklin County, we're starting to see some of the Franklin County effect, you might say, and areas nearby, like Lamoille County, are starting to see more leases going through at $1.50. So, and that's a function of location and the ability of producers that have capacity and are willing to haul the sap. They're willing to pay that higher rate. So another thing to think about is public land, and tapping on public land is pretty uncommon in the U.S. in general. And I have some data for Vermont that I can share. On state-owned land, there's only 7 licenses currently being held, and that's through the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. Total of 668 acres of land, and the price is set, and it's set by a committee. It's people at the department as well as sugar makers, and we also, Extension helps and provides some education on that committee as well. The lease rate rate had been 75 cents, and just this past year has bumped up to $1. So that's a new thing. I go to the next. There are also some agreements to tap on federal land. There's the Green Mountain National Forest in Vermont, and their pricing is a little different. They use a percentage of the average retail price for a gallon of syrup as reported to NASS, the USDA survey. And they also have a differential in price based on whether or not the sugar maker uses gravity or vacuum. And so they actually charge more if you use vacuum. And that works out, if you go to the next slide. Right, so there's 6 permits in the Forest Service land. It's about 9,000 taps total, 250 or so acres. And the average rate now for those agreements, 45 cents a tap for gravity and 70 cents for vacuum. They are in the process of reviewing this sort of entire pricing structure. So it'll be interesting to see those 6 permits if it does change in the future. And the concept of charging more for vacuum versus gravity, it's an interesting one. It depends on kind of how you look at it. From a tree perspective, the research shows that the wounding internally is about the same. We're still working on data on the sugar extraction part to see whether or not there's more stress as a result of vacuum tapping. But in terms of internal staining, the data indicates it's the same. And from a landowner perspective, the land is being used and you're foregoing other alternative uses regardless of if the operation is using gravity or vacuum. So it does bring up some questions. It's interesting that they would charge differently, but that's how they've chosen to do it.
All right, we've got a few more slides here before we'd like to open it up. Don't hesitate to, if you've got comments or questions, don't hesitate to put them in the chat window, and then when we get done, we can jump right into those. I get this call once in a while, people considering renting versus ownership. There's a lot of numbers here. We're going to share all these slides, so don't feel like you've got to write this down or memorize this. But I wanted to put at least a little snippet out there and get you thinking about renting versus ownership. So I worked up some numbers for 1,000 taps, estimated 18 acres. I think that's at about 55 or 60 taps per acre. And I did a really chunky number at $1,000 an acre. Some of your regions, hopefully the land might be more affordable, and we certainly know from calls recently actually that in certain cases the land is a lot more than $1,000 an acre, the forest purchases. But if you go down to the bottom there, the big bolded section with the green cells again, I think in any case, ownership versus renting, it's often conversations about cash flow, access to cash, access to credit, and potential borrowing. If you were to own the land or sought to own the land, you'd be making 10 years of payments on a loan totaling $22,910. But you'd also be accruing a nice asset on your balance sheet. We'll leave it to the we'll just leave it to know if that land will appreciate and at what percentage over time. But theoretically, you've got a balance or an asset there compared to the rental proposition where your cash cost will be certainly much less, $10,000 over 10 years, but you're going to have no corresponding asset. I don't think there's a right or wrong here. People have different reasons for ownership versus rental, different reasons for managing operating expenses. So there's a lot to dig into there, but I think this is how I would start to frame it, getting people to think about their cash flow needs and then also think about their trajectory for net worth accumulation over time, and if that's a goal for the business or the individual. So that one's not going away. Definitely a great consideration for anyone looking to expand their footprint for maple. We spent quite a few minutes talking about cash-based rental direct payments on a per tap basis. It's important to know that that is not the only mechanism that this can be done in the maple world, and important to reference other agricultural commodities that have different factors that go into rent setting. So there are times when landlords or producers are going to want to negotiate different risk sharing, and it can go both ways. There's definitely mechanisms and calculations where you can reduce rental rates in the situation of a crop failure. On the other side, if you're a landowner and there's a huge boom in maple prices, you may decide that as landowner you'd like a portion of those profits that go ahead or higher than any benchmark rate that you may have got previously. We've come up with this 12% benchmark as the factor where right now if we look at about a $1 a tap rental rate and we look at average yields for participants in Vermont, we come up with the rental rate would be 12% of the revenue generated from that tap. And I didn't say it, that's at bulk prices. So I think that's somewhere around $2.10 or $2.20 a pound bulk syrup at average Vermont yields. We get this 12% benchmark. And that becomes your calculation point if you want to start dealing with crop failure or market spikes. You can start to play with that percentage of gross revenue. You could have a rental rate that's higher by moving up to 15 or 20%. And you could bring it down if you wanted to do some discounting or some risk management to maybe 8 or 5%. So I mentioned that.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
I was
last
just
thing
going
I'll
to say,
say
yeah.
is we do have a rental calculator that's just going live right now. The link here is at the bottom of the screen. Like I said earlier, we can share these slides with everyone. This is the pilot link. I think in the next week or two, it should be upgraded and tweaked a little bit. If you want to go on now, you can definitely click that link and you can see the first stage of these different rental calculators to do a little forecasting or play with the numbers a little bit.
Well, I was going to add that there is some history of people having a rental rate relative to the price of syrup, and what the value of the different grades are in the bulk market. It's a little bit less of an issue now, where the various grades are much closer together in price. It was used a little bit more when there was a wider range in price between the lightest grades of syrup and the darkest. But there is some history of that. It is a little bit more complicated to calculate, but just wanted to make sure. You might have even seen some published guides that reference a price that indexes the price of syrup, not only just across the board, but within grade. So it's a little less common now, for sure.
Yeah, definitely fair to think about, though, over the life of a lease. If you're looking at 10, 15, or even a 20-year lease, I think it's fair for both the producer and the landowner to consider how the market and the technology for sap collection may change over the 20-year trajectory, and you may want to build in some flex into your relationship.
So when we asked the producers if they didn't have a strict certain dollar value per tap, what were some alternative structures that they used? We had everything from a gallon of syrup for every 100 taps that they rented. That was one. There was a straight dollar a tap payment, and then an index for if there was really good production. There was 10% of all the syrup would go to the landowner. So that's another way of doing it.
So with that, I think we're going to try to click some buttons here and open it up for questions or comments. We do have a couple questions that came in when people registered, so we've got those that we can share. And as I click through, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give everyone the option to unmute themselves. So if you do want to speak up, you're welcome to voice your questions. And like we said before, the chat option is there for sure. So if anyone wants to type anything in, I don't see that any questions have come in so far.
And just if you don't have a question, stay muted. It definitely makes the audio much better. So
yeah, for sure. So let's give everyone the option to unmute themselves. And I think we're certainly interested. We presented some cash rates. We showed some state by state comparisons, and then we've got some alternative rental structures. So if people have other alternative rental structures, definitely feel free to share them. Share what's working, what's not working, or even questions about what could work.
I guess I have a I have a question. I have some older producers with modern tubing systems, high vacuum 29 inch pumps, 7-year-old tubing, good install, low tap count on the lateral lines. They have monitoring systems installed, automation. They're looking at retiring, and they're looking at possibly renting out these woodlots. What are your thoughts on on those particular woodlots where you have that type of technology in them?
So you're saying essentially a turnkey operation that they would then rent to another presumably younger producer? Is that what you're saying?
That is correct. Yep.
Yeah, it's a little different because a lot of the operations that we deal with, it's the producer owns the system or does the install. I guess some of it would come down to the individual. They get in the woods and they see what's there. If they agree with the layout and are really pleased with it and don't see a lot of issues, that's going to probably lead them to pay more than the average. But I know a lot of producers who like to do it their own way, regardless of what's installed at the time. So it becomes what the market will bear. I suppose. Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, a couple things. I think this gets in, a little bit more complicated or less simple than just a straight up cash rental rate. As we worked with we mentioned that we do have a Sugarbush lease template, and I think the template that we've got it has some clauses in there, or some optional clauses for just the concept of buy-ins or buyouts. And it's not exactly your question, but I think just to wind it all back to these relationships, knowing that people haven't, there's a prior investment. There are definitely mechanisms to monetize that investment, and then to consider if there needs to be a buy-in or buyout as a part of the relationship, either now or after. So I mentioned buyout first, in the sense that that's where it's easy for potentially the installer that was referenced to say, these are my costs, or these are the costs that haven't been paid down. I'm going to lump them and say there's some sort of redeeming value here that's still, there's still a lifespan left, and we're going to monetize that, and that would be a buy-in. The next option would be to take that redeemed value, or the, not the replacement value, what am I looking for? The existing lifespan, and then prorate that over the term of a lease, right? So there's a math problem there that can be done, and not very complicated. And then the last thing I will mention, though, when we get into any sort of rental, and this is a little bit less than just renting the trees and the natural resource, this is now getting into the rental of bona fide infrastructure, tubing systems, technology, systems in place. In the agricultural world, we lean back on this acronym called the Dirty Five. And you can all look it up, do a Google search, Dirty Five, farm rental, and I'll tell you what it stands for. This would be the calculations for coming up with the embodied cost that you'd want to build into the rate. D would be for depreciation. So existing investment compared to a lifespan would give you an amount that's depreciable. The I in Dirty would be insurance. If there's any insurance that is in place that anyone is holding, that could be factored in. R for repairs, if the owner is going to have to maintain repairs themselves, building that in. T could be for taxes, if there are taxes related to the infrastructure. In some cases, the buildup may increase the taxable value. Not so much here if we're just looking at woods versus a sugar house. And then the other I think I said insurance already. The other I would be interest or opportunity cost on capital. So if the person had actually borrowed to do that investment, you could take the interest portion, generally not the capital portion or the capital investment or capital or the principal payment, but the interest portion, or again, opportunity cost on your own capital, 4 or 5% if you'd otherwise have it invested. So that is a way to start to factor in that built infrastructure, Dirty Five, and then price it out per unit per year.
Jim, the other thing I'll add is that 7 years in, those lateral lines are going to be looking to be replaced, and you're certainly you're around halfway into a cycle of replacement, depending on how long you have an appetite for leaving them out there. I think not just this scenario, but in general, I think people need to understand the costs associated with taking that stuff out. And the install cost is one thing, but there's a lot of labor and a lot of cost involved in getting rid of that material as well. So it's great that it's all set up, but if it is 7 years old, is that producer going to be on the hook for taking that out, or is the landowner going to retain ownership and responsibility for taking that material out? So turnkey is great, but you do have to think about the age of that system and how soon is that system going to need to be either partially replaced or completely replaced. Looks like we had a couple of questions in the chat. Aaron is asking, on state land, have you heard of what Massachusetts is allowing? And I don't know, but I'd be happy to happy to try to find out for you if you want. And then why so little licenses in Vermont? Is there a minimum tap quantity required, years in business, et cetera? There's a lot to that question, that second half of that question. Why so little licenses? I guess it depends. The program is run by Forest Parks and Recreation, and Maple is this odd thing where it's agriculture, it's forestry, it's both, and it hasn't necessarily been strongly embraced by everyone in the forestry community. And so there was a move about 12 years ago or so or more to try to encourage more property on state land to be open for tapping. And so it's been a bit of a slow process, but it hasn't been, broadly adopted as an alternative forest management. The other thing is that public land is beholden to large planning documents, forest management plans, for not just the little parcel where the sugar maples or red maples might be growing, but larger blocks. And so, land managers and public land foresters have to work within the constraints of those plans and can't just, open up parcels because someone asked them to. So if you're interested in more details, there is an application process, and you're right, I wouldn't say there's requirements that you have to have years in business, but it's part of the application. You do have to have insurance and prove that you are in good standing as an operator, or will be, and won't leave the state with an undue burden. Looks like Kate saw a lease to own.
Okay. I'll take a quick stab at that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'm just scrolling through here. Okay, question about lease to own. This is just a scenario. I'm assuming a producer has a basic lease rate for the existing Sugarbush, and then they built in a rental agreement for every tap added, I think $1 per tap, because the retired sugar maker wants to continue to own the land, but the new sugar maker will own the equipment and operation after 10 years. Well, again, this is where relationships and dynamics and specifics certainly come out. I'm not an expert on lease to own, but I would, I guess if I could get out of this one, I'd say that there's a lot of different ways to slice the relationship. And there's a way to hopefully navigate that as a way for accessibility in a way to let people's payments accrue into some ownership portion. Certainly individual relationships, preferences, and time frame is real important here too, to consider the status of things. I have been a part of different discussions with producers that have had the air quote opportunity to take over someone else's operation, either now or in several years. And as Mark referenced, it's really important to make sure that the acquiring party places the same value on the equipment or infrastructure that the exiting party does, whether it's now, in 5 years, or in 10 years, because technology changes and people's management styles change too. We could really dive into different rental relationships or rent to own, but I'd hesitate to do that more right now. Great question.
I'll say, just to chime in on what Mark was saying, that in that presentation that Rob Gay gave about what's a Sugarbush worth, and now we're moving strictly from rental rates to the broader Sugarbush lease agreement. But in general, those tubing systems are not going to be added as, having particular value, as far as collateral or towards a loan. It's almost a liability in a way, because, the lender can't pick that up and sell it somewhere else. It doesn't have value beyond that one location. So that's something to think about as well. And one last thing about Sugarbush leases, that we have seen leases where the operator, the sugar maker, installs and foots the bill for the whole tubing system, as you might expect. But there's a clause in the lease that if the landowner sells during the period of that lease, and the new owner is not interested in maintaining that lease, the seller of the land will pay the producer for essentially the prorated value of that initial install. So there's a way to structure a lease so that the producer isn't left holding a $50,000 tubing bill and have the property sold from under them within a few years.
Mark, this is Mike Gia from Land for Good. I can work with people on lease to own issues. People can contact me through Land for Good. If particularly people are talking about the real estate, the most common approach would be to have a lease with a purchase option, which may or may not credit any of the lease fee towards the purchase price. If they're not paying more than what the standard rental rate would be, then there's usually no equity or any money being put aside towards equity during the lease period. And it's the purchase option that gets the people access to the land after whatever period of time is built into the option.
No, great, Mike. I'm glad you're on. I was thinking about the Land for Good, both services and resources. I put it in the chat box for everyone that Mike Gia does work with Land for Good. They're New Hampshire based, but I know Mike's accessible.
Yeah, I'm a Vermont field agent, and we work with anybody primarily in New England, but anybody that's on this call that's outside of New England that wants to contact me can do that as well. But we primarily work in the 6 New England states.
Great. I want to ask Mark a question that came in from when people registered. Mark, is there a price differential on rental rates for sugar maple versus red maple trees?
Yep, that's a good question. I think broadly, if you have a bush that's all red maple, the market would tend to value that a little bit less. There's going to be some good data coming from some of Dr. Abby Vandenberg's work in the next year or so, looking at actually trying to look at the true difference, if any difference exists between red maple and sugar maple in terms of various factors like sap sweetness, syrup quality, that sort of thing. But right now, if it's some sort of mix between sugar maple and red maple, I would say in general, there isn't going to be a different price. Plus, just functionally, it would be really difficult. You'd have to have a very good inventory, and you'd have to do some broad percentage of, based on your forest inventory, what you have out there for red maple versus sugar maple. But I'm not aware of any pricing differences. It would fall more generally in the category of, is it a really good quality site? Does it have easy access? Are the trees of a size that are reasonable for harvesting sap? And the species, yeah, it might push the number down a little bit, but it's not going to be, if you had a really nice stand of red maple, most operations that have RO, they're going to see value in that, especially if some of the more important factors like location are checked and are a plus. They're probably not going to be too concerned.
So I'm gonna tag on that, I'm at the bottom of the chat window. I know we've got a couple of questions up higher, but there was a question mentioning this 12% benchmark that I mentioned. The 12% that I referenced, it's not a cost of goods. It's not an expense factor. This is one way to look at the rental rate as it relates to gross revenue per tap. So this is again a little different take than Mark's got. I agree that if you had red maples interspersed, it'd be really difficult to track. But theoretically, if you did have a red maple stand with a lower Brix, lower sugar, you would have a lower sugar production and a lower gross revenue coming off. And that 12% that I mentioned is about that $1 per tap rental rate. That's very common across, you've seen the survey and the multiple years. $1 per tap compared to average Vermont yields at current bulk prices, 225-ish, 220. So that's that gross, I would call it the percentage of gross revenue assigned to rental. So it is a cost. The rental cost is 12%. And I think we actually had a question that came in about, or a conversation about, well, what if you're not bulk? These are all based on bulk. This is where it gets a little dicey, because once we start going into retail value, we certainly have quite a bit higher gross revenue factor if we're looking at yield per tap compared to your recognized income per gallon equivalent that you sell. The challenge is the cost structure is different when you get into that retail or direct wholesale mindset. So it doesn't necessarily mean there's a whole pile more money in the mix. This would get into a real marginal analysis between, is there more margin in a bulk operation compared to a high value retail operation that may have a lot more marketing costs. So I don't have a great answer for you there, other than to say that the calculations are pretty basic, and it could be mapped out quite well if you wanted to check it out.
Looks like Matthew Fisher was asking if sugar content of sap would be a good method for calculating rental rate. That it would be a really tough thing. You would have to have, well, we know that sugar content varies throughout the season. You have a low point, high point in the middle somewhere, and then it deteriorates towards the end of the season. There would have to be a lot of agreement on what instruments, who's taking the measurements, when, where. It would be pretty difficult, I think, to do in general. That being said, people do that all the time when they're buying and selling sap. So I think it would be difficult on the rental rate. That's my take on it.
My take is I'd love to see people try, especially as you get to larger taps, 5,000, 10,000 tap agreements. Those distinctions of yield and sap are gonna add up. So if you did want to have your rental pegged to revenue potential, again, I think this is where you got to do the numbers to figure out how much effort is worth recalculating this, and if there's going to be a major distinction. And again, based on scale and based on these different factors, you can map that out and say, whoa, there's quite a bit of money on the table. Maybe it's worth going down that road. And if there isn't a lot of money on the table, it may not be worth the effort. I'm going to scroll back up. I think we had a couple other questions. We talked about the rent to own. Looks like we got a comment from Ontario. Hi, in Ontario, our survey in 2019 shows 42% rent taps at an average of $1.22. The range of tap cost is $0 to $2.10. So similar range. Thanks for that comment.
Looks like Mike's asking if you're using 1/3 of a gallon per tap in the calculation for 12%.
It's not quite 1/3. I think I based that on, I think I averaged out the last 5 years of Vermont as reported by NAS, Mike. So it might be 0.33. I know there was a high there, 0.36 or 0.39. So it's going to be based on a couple year average from the reported stats in NAS for statewide yields.
And John, I see your question. Can you clarify? Are you saying you're asking, isn't overall yield easier? Can you clarify that question a little bit?
I just meant where you're talking about measuring the sugar concentration of the sap. Aren't you easier? Is it easier just to average that out over the whole year and look at your total yield? Instead of measuring it daily and doing it that way.
Yeah, it's a much easier thing to measure.
The same, you'll get the same result. It's just, yeah. So that was my thought there. Wasn't sure if it was correct or not.
Yeah, and I think Mark mentioned different parties and different things to consider. You know, I think there's a few more tubes once you get into the sugar house, a few more places for syrup to get bottled and drummed and counted, and a couple more tubes where it maybe gets washed out or lost or bartered away. So just have that conversation about where the measurements will occur.
We are right at 8 or just after.
Before we sign off, I want to thank everyone for joining us. We're glad to have people to talk to. We don't really know what the outlook will be for the typical fall conferences. So we wanted to get out and keep this dialogue going through the summer and fall. This is the upcoming calendar that we've got. We do have 3 more sessions planned, one on August 19th, one on September 2nd, and one on September 16th. We do have a full schedule from October through, I think, December 12th. We just haven't posted it yet. So you can see the topics coming up: tapping practices to optimize yield and sustainability. We mentioned Sugarbush leases. We'll work through the new Sugarbush lease template, and hopefully we'll have the Sugar House lease finalized by then as well. I think Mark's going to do sap yields and tapping stained wood on the 16th of September. And then October, November, December, we've got some more presenters that'll talk about digital entrepreneurship, online marketing. I think we'll talk about Sugarbush appraisals and real estate valuations as well. There was a question about profitability. There'll be another presentation coming up, I think, that will talk more on specific economics and cost of production. So we'll get this out. You're on our email list. You'll see the schedule as it develops.
And I see
Mark?
that note from Matthew asking if we can post the websites in an email. Yeah, we'll definitely send out those URLs.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that question. We'll get the slides out and anything else attached to this as well. We're testing the recording. We're going to see how it comes out. We're going to see if we can get it posted. No guarantees on that because there's a few more steps to get it public suitable with the recorded version. So with that, I think we're gonna wrap up. Encourage you to stay in touch. Watch out for the coming session in 2 weeks, and keep the questions coming.
Stay healthy, everybody. Take care.